President Biden is combating claims made in the special counsel's report on his handling of classified documents, which question his memory.
During a hastily planned press conference yesterday, he strongly disputed an opinion expressed by the special counsel about his age and mental acuity.
I'm well-meaning, and I'm an elderly man, and I know what the hell I'm doing. I've been president. I put this country back on its feet. My memory is fine. My memory, take a look at what I've done since I become president. None of you thought I could pass any of the things I got passed. How'd that happen? You know, I guess I just forgot what was going on.
All right, so Leslie Sanchez and Joel Payne are joining us now to talk a little bit more about this and other things that happen in politics throughout the week. Leslie is a CBS News political analyst and served in the George W. Bush administration. And Joel is a CBS News political contributor, Democratic strategist, and chief communications officer for Move On. All right, guys, Joel, I'm going to start with you. And, of course, we're going to talk about these comments. How damaging, if they are these comments about Biden's memory? You know that this has kind of been the criticism that Republicans, but particularly Nikki Haley, has been lobbing his way. Is this going to be something that it's going to be hard for him to shake?
Well, first, I want to request a double segment. There's too much going on. I don't know if we have enough time in 7 minutes to cover it. You know, reading that report, the Her report, and just seeing the news reports of it, I have a background in campaign opposition research, and I swear to you, it read like an opposition research report that I used to do early in my career. It did not read like a special counsel's report. It kind of makes Robert Hur seem like a pretty unreliable narrator who probably too long don't read should have said, this man did not break the law. There were no laws that were broken. We've closed this case. Him opining about Joe Biden 48 hours after an international crisis, not remembering things from a decade before, seems a bit immaterial. So it's like cheap shots. It also, to me, some of the pretty gratuitous and crude things that he said about the president's memory of his son's death, I think that's not going to fare well with the general public. I think last thing I would say is the president and his team, I think, made the right decision to have him go out and to defend himself and to speak last night, because now the story I think that's being told today is not a feeble president who can't defend himself. Instead, it's a president who's resolute and who's standing up for himself and who's very clear-minded about this report and about its political implications for him.
Leslie, interestingly enough, former President Trump didn't use or didn't make any reference to this report yesterday, but Republicans are likely to use it, perhaps to deflect from some of the criminal charges that the former president is facing. What do you think?
This was a death knell, folks. You know, I appreciate my wonderful colleague Joel's interpretation of this. But if you just read through that 300-plus page report, it's astounding in terms of what do we know. Look, we know that the president at his time as a senator was taking classified information and not, returning it in a proper fashion, that a lot of very important records, and that the reason for not moving forward in terms of a harsher recommendation is because of the memory of the current president, and really drawing into question his capacity, his cognitive ability. And I think that distinction is really difficult to move away from. It's going to be incredibly difficult for the Democrats, especially when you have about 75% of the country agreeing that the president does not have the mental or physical capacity for another 4-year term. And to get that kind of agreement across the board is incredibly difficult in this polarized environment. But again, the president, and this by a third-party source, is having these significant challenges, and the American people are not going to ignore that.
Joel, I want to jump ahead to the president on the campaign trail. He was in Michigan, and he met with Muslim and Arab leaders in Michigan in an attempt to sort of work on the relationship. In the wake of some backlash he's received when it comes to dealing with the conflict in Gaza and Israel. Often international conflicts and international relations can sometimes bolster a president during an election, particularly if they, present well on the world stage. But is this going to continue to be, or will this hamper the president moving forward? Is this going to be one of kind of the more challenging components that he's going to have to deal with as he campaigns? Because it doesn't look like American influence, at least at this point, is making much of a difference when it comes to what Israel is doing in Gaza.
So I think it's a good thing that the president and his team are prioritizing those types of meetings with leaders like that. I will say you can only do so much with kind of grass tops level meetings. The real work is in doing kind of real grassroots level work to not only explain the rationale and explain the decision making from this administration, but also lay out the choice between the way I've governed as Joe Biden and the way Donald Trump not only is promising to govern, but what you saw him do 4 years ago when he instituted a Muslim ban and when he made your community feel outside from the inside of American life. And so I think that those arguments will be laid out with Muslim and Arab voters, Arab American voters. And I think over the long haul, I think the Biden team feels like they can probably do that work, but it's difficult work. It's hard work to keep that coalition together that he kept together in 2020, and he's going to need to keep together again in 2024. And I think it's fortunate for the president and his team that he's got 10 months to do that work.
Leslie, let me ask you, we kind of live in a bizarre world right now where Democrats are voting for funding and continuing to support the war in Ukraine, what's happening in Gaza with Israel, more money for the Israelis. In other words, funding military deployments and military action around the world, where you're seeing increasingly Republicans not willing to do that. Democrats coming together with Republicans in the Senate to pass a bill for border security that all the Republicans in Congress say they'd like to see, but now not doing it because they don't want to anger President Trump. So the question becomes, is any of that an albatross for Republicans going into an election year?
Republicans are going to continue to run on the issue of the border. And I think that's part of what your question is talking about. Immigration, the border, whether something was done. The Republican Senate pushback, and certainly the House pushback, is not that this was going to be some sort of victory for Biden on immigration, which is what they were saying. They were standing lockstep with the former President Trump, who asked them not to support this. As much as the issue, I think you've heard back, that there are so many powers that the president has currently. He could roll back his own executive order. He could stand by a current and existing law with respect to catch and release or Title 42, that the president failed to do. That on his watch, you saw a failure along La Frontera, the U.S.-Mexico border, and they don't feel giving additional powers is going to change that. So politically, I think Republicans and independents are going to say it's still an ongoing problem. But on the issue of foreign aid, I think Republicans are going to have to answer that question. You have many within the conference that do not support it, and many that do. So that will be, it's a ticking issue and a pressing issue for the conference going forward.
So I'm curious, when it comes to Republican voters, Leslie, this idea of Donald Trump, who is not in office, meddling with the progression of a piece of legislation that all sides agree that this is a crisis happening right now. And instead of helping, he is hampering the progress. You're not hearing from Republican voters, I don't know, weighing in on that, criticizing either congressional.
The Border Patrol supported the legislation. They said that they urged members of Congress, the Republican members, to help pass it. The people who are actually doing the job every day.
Yeah, and there was, I think, a healthy debate on this conversation. You had Border Patrol Association, you had a lot of former members coming and saying that something is better than nothing. But I think Republicans are going to continue to feel that the president has existing powers that he refuses to use, and emboldening him with different, laws and powers that he will be more of a Band-Aid than solving the problem. I think to be honest about that, they see this as a political issue. They want to use in campaign ads, and going into November, all of the images of this open, porous border, and beating on that issue, because they know with respect to 2024, it's a detonation issue. It is not just along the U.S.-Mexico border. It's in New Hampshire. It's in Michigan. It's in Pennsylvania. Every state is grappling with how to handle this crisis. So politically, they didn't think there was enough there. And they got, from a governor's perspective, they think the president wouldn't use those powers effectively.
Joe, was President Trump invested with those same executive powers that Republicans are calling for for President Biden to use?
Yeah, I remember 2017 to 2021. Donald Trump was president for 4 years, right? If those powers existed then Donald Trump, who is Captain Close the Border, probably would have used them at that time. So I think that argument by my Republican friends does fall flat. The thing that jumps out to me here too also is like the bad faith and the hypocrisy aside, what Republicans essentially did this week, or not just this week, over the last few weeks, they wasted time. They continued to tear down the American people's faith in our institutions. And ultimately, they ended up doing what Joe Biden wanted to do like 2 months ago, which is just pass the bill for support for Israel, for Palestine, for Ukraine separately, which is where this all started. So the poor leadership and the bad faith in the Republican Party wasted so much of the American people's time. And I can tell you, I know that the folks, I've talked to them in Biden world, are going to focus on this, and this is going to be a key part of their argument going into this election season.
All right, Joel Payne, Leslie Sanchez, happy Friday, guys.